Time was running out. Movers rumbled up the cracked porch steps, their boxes thudding against the faded wood. Eleanor clutched her brass key like a lifeline, heart-hammering. Walter leaned heavily on his cane, jaw set, refusing to give an inch. Outside, a crowd whispered and lingered, eyes darting between the couple and the man waving eviction papers like a weapon. This wasn't just about property. It was about decades of memory, of life built brick by brick, threatened in a single cruel morning. And just when it seemed all hope was lost, something arrived that would change everything. What would happen when the people who loved them most refused to stay hidden? But behind the looming threat, a secret was stirring, one that could turn the entire street upside down. Morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the living room. Eleanor hummed quietly as she arranged teacups on the table, her hand steady despite the faint tremor in her fingers. Walter shuffled past, cane tapping lightly on the hardwood, a newspaper tucked under his arm. For decades, this little house had been their sanctuary, a place filled with laughter, family photos, and the scent of lemon polish. Their neighbors knew them as kind, gentle, resilient. Their lives had always been measured in quiet routines. Morning coffee, tending the garden, calling each other by the little nicknames no one else used. But even in this peaceful morning, there was a shadow they couldn't ignore. A man named Victor had been circling the block, leaving letters, making phone calls, and whispering about progress, while their world quietly trembled. The subtle tension had grown heavier with each knock, each glance from the window, each lingering photo of their children on the mantel. Eleanor pressed the brass key against her chest, feeling the weight of memories, and of a threat that refused to leave. Walter adjusted his collar, eyes narrowing at the movement outside. They had built a life here, brick by brick, laugh by laugh, but would it be enough to hold back what was coming? And when the first real threat crossed their threshold, would anyone stand with them, or would the world simply look away? What they didn't know was that help was coming, but it would arrive in a way they could never have imagined. By mid-morning, the quiet neighborhood had transformed into a stage of tension. Victor Holloway, clipboard in hand and smile tight as a wire, paced the sidewalk. He measured the porch steps, tapped the mailbox, and circled the small garden as if calculating every crack in the pavement. Cameras in hand, he documented Eleanor and Walter's home with a precision that felt invasive, predatory. "Your lease terms are clear," he called once, voice smooth but cold, drifting over the lawn. "Markets change, so do your rights." Eleanor's hands tightened around the brass key, the ribbon worn soft from years of holding it. "Rights don't change with prices," she whispered to Walter, her voice carrying the quiet steel of a woman who had fought too many battles to back down now. Walter tapped his cane lightly against the top step, each echo a pulse of defiance. He had spent years building this life, raising children, and facing the subtle prejudices that lingered in every corner of their community. They were not strangers to discrimination, but Victor's actions cut deeper. It wasn't just about money. It was about erasing a life, a history, because of the color of their skin. The first knock on the door came sharp, sudden, a sharp rap that reverberated like an alarm. Eleanor froze, glancing at the envelope Victor had pushed through the mail slot hours earlier. It read, "Final notice, 30 days. Walter's lips pressed into a thin line as he folded the letter carefully and tucked it under a cookbook, as though hiding it might hide the injustice itself. Across the street, neighbors murmured, curiosity and concern threading through their whispers. Some tried to ignore it. Others leaned out, caught in the tension like moths to a flame. Victor didn't stop. He returned with letters stapled to trees, measurements taken of windows and roof lines, and each time, Eleanor documented them, filing the small proofs that spoke louder than any argument. Birth certificates, adoption decrees, birthday cards, evidence of decades of family, of roots that could not be bought or sold. Yet the law seemed indifferent, mechanical, ready to sweep them aside as though the life of an elderly black couple were nothing more than a transaction. The neighborhood felt heavy with anticipation. A teenager on a bike slowed to whisper into a phone, "This is going viral if it gets ugly." Cars pause in front yards. Eyes peer from behind curtains. And through it all, the house seemed alive, holding its breath alongside Eleanor and Walter. The scent of lemon polish and old paper mingled with rain on asphalt, a fragile barrier against a storm of injustice pressing at their door. By afternoon, the tension had grown into a tangible weight. The moving truck appeared at the corner, idling like a predator waiting for a signal. The driver tapped the wheel impatiently, glancing at the porch as though anticipating surrender. Eleanor pressed the key to her chest again, feeling history in its brass coldness. Walter's grip on his cane tightened. They had survived overt and subtle racism all their lives, but this was different. Calculated, sanctioned, and public. The threat was no longer invisible. It had faces, names, and a deadline. Victor approached once more, his clipboard raised as though it were a weapon. "Time's up," he said, his tone sharp, but Eleanor did not flinch. Walter straightened slightly, murmuring under his breath about the nights he had stayed awake, making cribs for children, building a home that had always welcomed everyone. They were prepared to fight, to stand, even if the world seemed set against them. Every knock on the door, every glare from the sidewalk, every stapled notice felt like a countdown, but also fanned the embers of resilience burning quietly inside them. And then, just as the first clouds of despair seemed to settle, the sound of a horn cut to the hum of tension, low and deliberate. Heads turned. Phones lifted. A sleek black sedan glided to the curb, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The rain-slicked streets reflected the growing crowd, anticipation curling in the air like smoke. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the key. Walter braced on his cane. Help was coming, but who it was and what it meant would change everything. And when the first figure stepped out, the world they had known would collide with a force they never expected. What would happen when those who loved the most refused to stay hidden? The horn echoed through the street, cutting through the drizzle like a signal. Neighbors craned their necks. Phones lifted, breaths held. A sleek black sedan came to a stop, tires hissing on wet asphalt. The door opened, and Sarah stepped out, tall and steady in her navy suit. Her eyes found Eleanor and Walter immediately, unwavering and sharp. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase, flipped open a folder, and revealed pages stamped in bold red, a legal injunction filed that morning. "You can't move them." Her voice carried over the quiet hum of the street, crystal clear and resolute. "Not today. Not tomorrow." Victor faltered. His smirk wavered. Just a flicker, but the tension that had hung over the block like a storm cloud began to shift. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The evidence and the attention pressed down on him like the weight of every injustice ignored for decades. He waved his hands, muttered about law and procedure, but the pause was telling. The crowd leaned in, sensing a shift, sensing the beginning of justice. Then a second vehicle rolled into view, a military jeep, green and imposing, tires crunching over puddles. David stepped out, uniform crisp, metals glinting, his presence commanding. He didn't speak at first, just scanned the scene with an intensity that made the movers hesitate, made Victor's confident posture wobble. "Evicting seniors under fraudulent grounds qualifies as elder abuse," he said finally, voice low, but carrying over the street. "It's not just civil, it's criminal. You want this on record?" The sheriff, caught between procedure and conscience, shifted uneasily. The movers froze, boxes mid-step, boots planted on slick pavement. Victor's clipboard rattled in his hands. Whispers rippled through the neighbors. "Is that their son?" The realization hit the crowd. These weren't strangers. These were the people who had loved Eleanor and Walter enough to step into the storm. The final act arrived in a black SUV, glossy and authoritative. Michael emerged, phone still in hand, confidence radiating. Behind him, press cameras followed, capturing every second. "Developers love publicity until it looks like bullying old folks," he said, voice smooth, controlled. "Guess who's trending now?" He held up documents, proof that the mortgage was now legally his, that Victor's claim was void. "You're trespassing," he added, letting the words sink like stones in the heavy air. Victor's composure shattered. Hands shaking, he dropped his clipboard. The eviction notices fell like rain, red stamps blurred by drizzle. He opened his mouth again, but the words faltered, weak against the force of truth standing on the porch. Eleanor pressed a brass key to her chest, ribbon warm from her palm, and for the first time in days, felt her shoulders loosen just slightly. Walter leaned on his cane, breath catching, eyes shining with the relief and disbelief of survival. The crowd exhaled as one. Phones hovered, capturing not just an eviction stopped, but a reckoning. For once, the power of a family, of love and resilience, collided head-on with systemic cruelty and won. Victor looked small, diminished against the presence of 3 children who refused to stay hidden, who refused to let their parents be erased. But even in that triumph, the storm of emotion lingered. Anger, relief, pride, exhaustion, all tangled in the humid drizzle. Eleanor exhaled slowly, as if letting decades of fear escape in one long breath. Walter's cane tapped gently, a quiet rhythm of endurance. The porch, the house, the key, they all held their history, their victories, their scars. And as the crowd watched, as the rain fell in soft, cold streaks across the street, one question hung in the air, heavier than the storm. How many more families would have to fight like this before the world finally noticed? What came next would not just be a home saved, but a statement no one on that block would ever forget. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, leaving the street slick and reflective, like a mirror holding the weight of the morning's events. Eleanor and Walter stood on the porch, side by side, the brass key warm in her hand, their children flanking them like a shield no injustice could pierce. The eviction had threatened to erase decades of memory, love, and resilience had been stopped, but the echoes of fear, of intimidation, and of racial prejudice lingered. The fight was over for now, but the system that allowed such cruelty to reach their doorstep had not disappeared. Neighbors lingered, whispers filled the air, some expressing awe, others shame, all witnesses to a confrontation that exposed the quiet, systemic bias that too often targets the vulnerable. Eleanor pressed a key against her chest once more, feeling the weight of her life's work, of family, home, and dignity, protected not by luck, but by courage, unity, and love. Walter's cane tapped lightly against the porch floor, a slow rhythm of survival, endurance, and quiet triumph. They had faced the worst that a system blinded by greed and prejudice could offer, and they had survived, stronger, together. The children, Sarah, David, and Michael, stood not only as protectors, but as symbols of accountability, of action, of the power of showing up for the ones who build our world quietly, often unseen. Their presence sent a message far beyond the street, that love and justice, when unwavering, can confront even the most calculated attempts to erase history and humanity. Yet, the story did not end with relief alone. It carried a challenge, one that reaches far beyond a single block, a single family, or a single landlord. It was a reminder that racial injustice is rarely dramatic on its own. It creeps quietly in legal forms, in policies, in assumptions, until someone refuses to look away. And when we do refuse, when we rise, when we fight, even small acts become powerful statements that ripple outward, demanding recognition, respect, and change. Eleanor exhaled, letting the tension leave her shoulders, but her eyes remained watchful, knowing that vigilance was part of the legacy they must uphold. Walter's gaze drifted over the familiar garden, the worn steps, the photos that lined the mantel, each a testament to a life worth defending. And as the street settled into an uneasy calm, one truth remained crystal clear. Systems may try to silence, intimidate, or erase, but the courage to stand and protect those who built the world quietly cannot be measured. How many more families must fight in silence before we all decide that injustice will no longer go unchallenged? This wasn't just a house saved. It was a message sent. Love, courage, and unity can defy the deepest currents of prejudice, and the world will notice if we refuse to stay silent.